I'm Rachel Glennerster. I'm Executive Director of the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, which is a centre at MIT. I do randomised evaluations of social and economic programmes. A lot of my work's been in Sierra Leone, but I've also done work in India and Bangladesh and Pakistan. So I guess part of my interest in the transparency work is I was involved I've now done 4 pre-analysis plans where we commission in advance to how we're going to analyse the data. This is, I think, a useful tool. I think it's particularly useful in areas where you have a very large number of outcomes variables, and there's not an obvious one which is the obvious outcome measure. And I got involved in this doing some work on community-driven development where we had 310 plus outcome measures, and again there were different ways of measuring social capital, and it wasn't obvious that there was one single measure. We needed sort of all of them, and so thinking ahead of time about how we were going to group these indicators was, I think, very important. I've been involved in doing this kind of work now a number of times and realised just how complicated and difficult it is. And one of the projects that I worked on, we had 7 different arms, and trying to write in advance exactly how you're going to analyse this without knowing which arms were going to be positive, which might be negative, which ones would be insignificant, really turned out to be a complete nightmare. And there were things that we wish we'd done differently. And so that led to my next attempt to do this kind of transparency of analysis. And we really came at it in a completely different way of writing down how we do the first step and then doing that, and then using that information from the first step to write another, how we're going to analyse the next bit of data. And we split it up into these different approaches, and this is one of the things I'm going to talk about at this conference. But I think our learning about how to be transparent is really evolving. So I think this issue of how do you commit in advance to analysing your data and when you should do that and how you should do it is something that's evolving, and I think we need lots of discussions about. I also think it's very important that we get more data from our experiments out and published. And I think everyone agrees that we ought to be doing this, but how you do it or just setting up systems to make it easier is very important, because it's an enormous amount of work, and we don't have the right incentives to do it. So sometimes funders insist that we have to commit to publish our data, and that's very helpful incentive. But I think there's also more that we can do, and this isn't really my expertise, but I'd like to learn about it more, and we have people within JPAL who are thinking about it, to make the data collection process involve steps which then make it easier to publish later. And I think that kind of thing, basically anything we can do to make it easier, is going to be a huge part of getting more data up on the web. And I think where we have got data up, we've seen it used enormously. So one thing which is pretty unique in BITS is that it's cross-disciplinary across the social sciences. And I don't normally get to talk to people working in other areas of social science except political science, where there are other fora where we discuss. And I think it's really helpful to understand the guidelines or ways of working that other disciplines are taking on, so that we can then try and align what economics is doing. Now, I mean, I can't speak for economists in general, but I think these discussions are very important to establish similar approaches, because sometimes we have similar objectives across the social sciences, but because we come at them in different ways, we then can't talk to each other. we say, oh, you know, they don't do things right because they're not doing it our way, whereas actually there's not very much difference between them. So deliberately getting us to sit together and hash out, to the extent that we can, common guidelines and common approaches, I think it's really helpful. And I think if we are going to move forward on transparency, it's very important to build consensus within the professions that this is important and this is how we should approach the questions.